The wind screamed across the mountains as if the earth itself was mourning. Snow whipped sideways in a relentless storm, clawing at the woman who staggered through it, clutching a baby to her chest as if she could shield him from a world that wanted them both buried beneath the drifts. Her arms ached, her back bent under the weight of exhaustion, but she refused to let go. The child whimpered, his frail voice nearly lost in the roar of the blizzard. Yet that sound, thin and desperate as it was, drove her forward when her legs screamed to collapse. Her dress, once neat and carefully mended, hung in tatters, stiff with ice at the hem. Each step sank to her knees, and each time she lifted her foot the snow dragged it back as though it wanted to keep her forever. Her shoes had holes worn through the leather, her toes numb to the point she wasn't sure if they still belonged to her. She pressed the baby tighter, whispering through cracked lips words she hoped he could feel even if he couldn't understand. He was her last tether to life, the last fragile thread binding her to this bitter wilderness. She had already buried her husband. She remembered the way his breath had rattled in his chest, fever stealing his strength in the bitter nights that had followed their escape. She had dug his grave with her bare hands until her fingers bled, stacking rocks over him so wolves wouldn't dig him up. She had stood there numb, the child crying in her arms, unable to feel grief the way she once would have. There had been no time. She had to move, had to keep walking, because death waited on all sides. She had carried her son into the storm with no more plan than the faint hope that something, someone, might exist ahead. But hope was a dangerous thing in these mountains. The snow was endless, the sky a gray ceiling pressing down. Every sound carried strange in the cold, and she swore more than once she heard wolves pacing her steps somewhere in the dark line of trees. She had seen their prints 2 days ago. They hadn't attacked yet, but she knew they were waiting, watching, letting exhaustion do their work for them. The baby stirred again, lips trembling, his weak cry barely audible. She tried to hush him, though she knew he wasn't asking for silence. He was asking for milk, for warmth, for safety she could not give. Her knees buckled. She hit the ground with a muffled cry, snow puffing up around her. She curled her body over her son, her breath shallow and ragged. A part of her longed to let sleep take her. The cold promised rest, an end to struggle, and her body ached for it. She could almost imagine laying him gently down, closing her eyes, and surrendering to the storm. But the sound of him, those frail, trembling cries, dragged her back from the edge. She could not let him die here, not while she still drew breath. She forced herself up. Her muscles screamed, but she pushed forward again, stumbling blindly. And then, through the blur of wind and snow, she thought she saw it. A shape, a structure where no tree should stand. At first she thought it a trick of her frozen mind, some cruel vision meant to torture her with false hope. But then the outline sharpened, rough logs stacked into walls, a slanted roof sagging under snow, smoke trailing from a crooked chimney. A cabin. Her heart lurched. The sight filled her with equal parts relief and dread. Someone lived here. Someone who might help, or someone who might drive her off, or worse. But there was no choice left. Her body was finished, her child dying in her arms. She staggered toward it, each step heavier, the cabin swimming in and out of her vision until her legs gave out entirely. She fell forward onto the doorstep, barely able to shield the baby as she landed hard against the wood. Her hand lifted weakly, fingers brushing the door, but she didn't have the strength to knock. Darkness swept over her. She curled around her son, tucking him into the hollow of her chest, her last thought of prayer whispered in silence. Inside, the man heard it first as a faint sound beneath the storm. A knock too weak to be true, more like a body collapsing against his door. He set aside the tool he had been sharpening and listened. Years of solitude had honed his senses sharp. He knew the difference between the wind shifting a branch and something human. Rifle in hand, he rose from the chair by the fire and stepped toward the door. He was a mountain of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a coat of animal hide that smelled of smoke and pine. His beard was thick, streaked with gray, his face hard as carved stone, eyes narrowed from years of scanning horizons that always held danger. Life had left its scars across him, scars not just on his skin, but in the way he moved, slow, deliberate, prepared for betrayal. He had chosen this solitude, not because he loved it, but because he no longer trusted himself among people. The door creaked open. The sight before him made him freeze. A woman lay collapsed on the threshold, snow already gathering on her hair and shoulders, her arms wrapped tight around a bundle. For a long moment he did not move, suspicion warring with instinct. He had lived too long in a world where mercy could cost a man his life. Yet as he lowered his gaze to the bundle, the choice was made for him. A baby's cry broke the storm's howl, a thin, pitiful sound. His jaw tightened. Memories he had buried deep clawed their way to the surface. A child's laugh, a fever that took too quickly, the silence that had followed. He had sworn never again. He had walled himself against feeling. But the sound of that baby pierced through every defense. He set the rifle aside and bent down. His arms slid beneath the woman and child, lifting them effortlessly though they weighed less than they should. He carried them inside, shutting the storm behind him. The cabin was warm compared to the outside, though the fire had burned low. He set them on the cot in the corner, stripped off his heavy coat, and spread it over them both. The woman stirred faintly, eyes cracking open, glazed with fear and confusion. Her lips moved, whispering words he didn't understand, her hand clutching the baby tighter as if she thought he might take the child away. He said nothing. He rarely did anymore. Instead, he moved to the fire, added wood until the flames leapt higher, then filled a pot with snow and set it on the stones. He pulled a bundle of dried meat from a shelf and set it within reach. His hands, though rough, moved carefully as he touched the baby's small feet, rubbing warmth into them, holding the child closer to the fire's glow. Slowly, color crept back into the child's skin. The woman's eyes softened with relief. She tried to form words again, perhaps thanks, perhaps plea, but her strength failed. Her head fell back onto the cot. Sleep claimed her, her breath ragged but steady. The baby quieted, his tiny chest rising and falling against her. The man sat back, the weight of the coat still warm on his shoulders though it now covered them instead. He stared into the flames, the crackle of the fire filling the silence. He knew what he had done. He had let them into a life he had sworn to keep shut to the world. He told himself it was only for the night, only until the storm passed. But deep down he knew better. Something had shifted. Outside, wolves howled, their voices long and mournful across the ridges. The storm battered the cabin walls, demanding entry, promising death to those caught outside. But inside, 3 lives clung to fragile safety. A woman whose strength had carried her farther than reason should have allowed. A child whose cries had refused to be silenced. And a man who had long ago buried his heart, only to find it stirring again against his will. The night dragged on. He stayed awake by the fire, rifle across his knees, eyes on the door. The ghosts of his past pressed heavy, but he did not move them aside. He let them burn in the firelight, let them remind him that he was still alive, still capable of choosing mercy. The storm would pass. The world outside would remain as cruel as ever. But in that moment, in that small cabin, he had done something he thought himself no longer able to do. He had cared, and that changed everything. The woman awoke to silence. For a moment she thought perhaps she had died and been carried into some dream of warmth, for the ache in her bones was gone, replaced by the steady glow of heat against the skin. She shifted, blinking through the blur of sleep, and found herself beneath a heavy coat smelling of pine smoke and fur. Her child lay nestled against her chest, his tiny lips parted, his breath steady. Relief swelled in her chest until tears stung her eyes. He was alive. Then her gaze lifted and she froze. Across the room, in the dim light of the fire, sat the man. He was motionless, a shadow more than a figure, his face hidden behind the curtain of his beard and the low brim of a worn hat he had not bothered to remove. His rifle rested against his leg, his large hand curled loosely around it as if even in the warmth of his cabin, even after saving her, he could not imagine lowering his guard. His eyes, sharp and watchful, were fixed not on the fire but on her. Fear crawled through her chest. She tightened her arms around her child. Her lips moved, but her throat was raw, the word rasping out. "Please, don't take him." The man did not reply. He tilted his head slightly, the fire catching in his eyes, revealing not cruelty but something colder, caution, suspicion. He watched her the way one might watch a wolf nosing too close to the firelight, not yet attacking, but never to be trusted. Her pulse raced. She tried again, voice shaking. "I'll go. When the storm clears. We won't trouble you." Still no answer, only the crackle of the fire, the moan of the storm outside, and the steady sound of her child's breathing. At last, the man shifted. He leaned forward, set the rifle aside, and placed a wooden bowl onto the table near her. Steam curled up from its surface, carrying the thin scent of broth. His voice, when it came, was deep and rough with disuse, like a door opening on rusty hinges. "Eat!" Her lips parted in surprise. She hesitated, suspicion warring with need, but hunger gnawed at her with sharp teeth. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and drew the bowl close. The first sip burned her tongue, but the heat spread through her body like fire chasing frost from her veins. She swallowed greedily, tears rising again as warmth returned to her chest. The man said nothing more. He simply sat back, watching, his face unreadable. When the bowl was empty, she laid her head back, exhaustion pulling at her again. The baby stirred, and she looked down, rocking him gently, whispering a lullaby in her native tongue. The song was soft, carrying notes of grief and love woven together, the melody fragile as glass. She thought the man might ignore it, but when she glanced up she saw his hand tighten against his knee, his eyes briefly closing as though the sound unearthed something he had long buried. She fell asleep once more, her son clutched tight. The days that followed blurred into a fragile rhythm. The storm raged without end, howling against the log walls, snow piling high until the world beyond the window seemed erased entirely. The man hunted when the winds eased, moving with the sure silence of a predator, returning with rabbits or game birds that he skinned with quick, practiced hands. He never asked her name, never spoke more than a handful of words. Yet he left food for her, and each evening the fire was already burning when she woke. She watched him with wary eyes. His presence was heavy, every movement deliberate, his silence thick with something unspoken. He was not cruel, but neither was he gentle. He was simply there, a mountain-given flesh, a force shaped by years alone in the wilderness. She wondered what past had carved him into this shape, what loss had hardened him so completely. At night, when she thought he slept, she whispered to her son of the life they had fled. She told him of soldiers who had come to their village, of fire and screams and the desperate flight that had driven her into the mountains. She told him of his father's bravery, how he had shielded them until sickness stole him away. She told him she would not fail, that she would keep him safe. But her words trembled with doubt. The man heard more than she knew. His sleep was light, his ears trained to catch every sound. He listened, not by choice but because the cabin was small and her voice carried in the quiet. He learned pieces of her story in fragments, enough to know she had been hunted, enough to know danger clung to her even now. He told himself it was not his concern. But each time the baby whimpered, each time the woman's voice cracked with fear, he felt the weight of their presence binding him tighter. One evening, as the storm relented, the woman rose from the cot for the first time. Her legs shook, but she stood, swaying slightly. The man, sitting by the fire, looked up. She met his gaze with something fragile but firm. "I need to help. I can't just take from you." He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded toward the pile of firewood stacked against the wall. She understood. Slowly, she carried pieces to the hearth, feeding the flames. Her hands trembled with the effort, but the pride in her eyes did not. That night, the silence between them felt different. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest step toward it. But suspicion lingered still. The next morning, she woke to find him gone. Panic clawed through her until she saw the fresh tracks in the snow outside the door. He had gone hunting. Relief eased her chest, but fear soon replaced it. Alone, she listened to the wolves pacing nearer, their howls closer than before. She clutched the baby and prayed he would return. Hours dragged. Then at last, the door opened, and he stepped inside, a deer slung over his shoulders. Blood streaked the snow at his boots. He set the carcass down with practiced efficiency and began to butcher it without a word. She stayed, both horrified and grateful. His hands, so rough and stained, worked with surprising care, each cut precise. She wanted to thank him, but the words stuck. Instead, she offered silence, and he accepted it. That night, as the smell of roasting venison filled the cabin, something shifted again. She saw the faintest trace of weariness in his face, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought she wasn't watching. He was not invincible. He was only a man, scarred, haunted, but human still. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. Why did you help us?" He did not look at her. The knife paused in his hand, then resumed its slow, steady motion. "Because he cried." His gaze flicked toward the baby, then away. Couldn't ignore it. The words were few, but they struck deep. She said nothing more, but in her chest something loosened. The storm broke days later, the sky clearing to a brittle blue. The world outside was unrecognizable, the landscape buried beneath drifts taller than a man. The woman stepped outside with her child wrapped tight, the cold biting at her cheeks. For the first time, she saw the mountains in their full, merciless beauty, ridges sharp as blades, forest bowing beneath snow, silence stretching endlessly. The man stood a few paces away, axe in hand, splitting logs. His movements were sure, every swing efficient. She watched him, a question burning in her chest. How long could they stay? How long before the world outside found them again? That night, as a fire burned low, she asked him quietly, "When the snow melts, will you turn us out?" His eyes lifted, meeting hers across the fire. His expression did not change, but something in his gaze softened, just barely. "We'll see." It was not a promise, but it was not a sentence either. And so the fragile balance held. Suspicion lingered like a shadow, but survival bound them together. The woman and her child, clinging to the man's unwilling mercy. The man, telling himself each day he owed them nothing, yet each night spreading his coat over them before the fire. The wolves still howled in the distance. Tracks in the snow hinted at eyes watching from the tree line. The danger that had driven her into the mountains had not vanished. It waited, patient, beyond the cabin walls. But for now, within those walls, 3 lives endured together, bound not by trust yet, but by necessity. The storm had passed, but the true test was only beginning. The thaw began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Drops of meltwater to trace down the edges of the cabin's roof, pattering into the snow that lay piled like the bones of winter. By day, the air no longer burned with its icy bite, though the night still carried the bite of frost. The woman stood at the doorway one morning, her child bundled tightly against her chest, and breathed air that no longer hurt to inhale. The mountains stretched before her, endless and white, but somewhere beneath their layers of snow she felt the promise of change. The man moved behind her, his steps solid on the wooden floor. He didn't speak. He rarely did. Yet his presence was as steady as the mountains themselves, and she had grown attuned to it, almost comforted by it. The baby stirred in her arms, tiny fingers curling, and she hushed him softly, her thoughts twisted with worry and gratitude alike. They had survived, but survival was never permanent. It was only borrowed time, and debt always came due. The silence between them had changed in subtle ways. No longer sharp with suspicion, it had become an uneasy truce, a tether stretched taut. He provided, hunted, kept the wolves at bay. She cooked, cleaned, tended the fire, and mended his worn clothes with threads pulled from her own. It was not trust, not yet, but something fragile had taken root, a thing neither of them named aloud. One evening, as dusk pressed against the cabin, the man returned from a hunt with a stiffness in his gait. He set down a brace of rabbits on the table, but his face was drawn, his jaw locked. She noticed at once. "What is it?" she asked, though she half feared the answer. He removed his hat, rubbed a hand across his weathered brow, and finally spoke. "Tracks, not wolves." Her heart jolted. She tightened her hold on her child. "Man!" His eyes flicked toward her, grim and certain. "Man!" The air in the cabin grew heavy. He said no more, but she needed none. She had fled men, soldiers who would not forgive, who would not forget. If they had come this far into the mountains, it meant they were still hunting her, still hunting the baby. Her lips trembled, but she forced the words out. "We should run." The man's gaze hardened. Nowhere to run. Snow's too deep, and if they found this valley, they'll find the tracks we leave. He looked at the child, his expression unreadable, then back at her, only choice is to stand. Her knees weakened beneath her, but she drew herself tall, clutching her son as though her arm could shield him from a world. Fear threatened to consume her, yet she found a flicker of strength in the man's steady voice. He was not rattled. He was a man carved for such reckonings. That night, he prepared, His rifle was cleaned, every movement slow and deliberate. He sharpened his knife, set traps near the tree line, stacked wood to block the shutters. The woman sat by the fire, her child in her lap, watching him with a mixture of dread and awe. She saw not just a mountain hermit, but a soldier of solitude, forged by years of surviving what others could not. When at last he looked at her, his voice was low. "If they come, you don't open that door. Not until I say." She swallowed hard. "And if you fall." His eyes lingered on her, steady and unblinking. "Then you run. Take the boy. Find high ground. Don't stop." Her breath caught. The thought of leaving him, this man who had saved them, who had given them shelter, tore at her. Yet she knew better than to argue. He was not a man who wasted words. The next day dawned bright but brittle, the sky a cool, endless blue. From the ridge beyond the frozen creek, figures appeared, 3 of them, moving with a slow, careful tread of hunters. Their rifles glinted in the pale sun. The man spotted them first from a narrow slit in the shutter. His jaw tightened. "They've found us." The woman pressed her son against her chest, rocking him even as terror surged in her veins. She wanted to scream, to flee, to beg the heavens for mercy. But she said nothing. She simply watched as a man took his rifle, positioned himself by the window, and became stone. The hours stretched. The strangers did not come close at once. They circled, testing the air, perhaps uncertain if the cabin was inhabited. The wolves howled in the distance, restless with the scent of intruders. The child whimpered, and the woman hushed him, her heart pounding loud enough she feared the men outside might hear it. Then, as the sun dipped low, a voice rang out across the clearing. Harsh, guttural words in a tongue she recognized. Orders, threats. The soldiers had not forgotten. They demanded she be handed over, demanded the child. The blood drained from her face. The man answered with silence. He simply adjusted his grip on the rifle. The first shot came sudden, shattering the quiet, splintering wood near the window. The baby cried out, and she clutched him tighter, biting back her own scream. The man remained unshaken. He returned fire, the crack of his rifle echoing across the valley, sending crows scattering into the sky. One of the figures outside dropped into the snow, motionless. The fight had begun. Hours blurred into chaos. Smoke from gunfire hung heavy, the acrid scent burning her nose. The man moved with ruthless precision, each shot measured, each decision exact. He was not reckless. He was methodical, a predator defending his den. The woman, though trembling, did not collapse. She fed the fire to keep smoke within the cabin, masked their shadows, pressed cloth to the baby's ears to soften the thunder of gunfire. 2 men remained outside, their shadows flickering through the trees. Shots rang, windows shattered, and the cabin walls groaned under the assault. The woman prayed beneath her breath, words spilling in her native tongue. At last, silence fell again. The snow was stained with blood outside, and the wind carried only the hollow cries of crows. The man lowered his rifle, his chest rising and falling with exertion. He looked toward her, sweat streaking his brow. "It's done." But it was not done. Not fully, for as he spoke, a figure stirred in the snow, a soldier not felled, but wounded. With desperate strength, the man dragged himself upright, rifle shaking in his grip. The mountain man turned, too slow this time. The shot rang. The woman screamed. The man staggered, pain searing through his side. Blood bloomed dark against his coat. Yet even as he faltered, he raised his own weapon, fired once more, and the last of the soldiers fell lifeless into the snow. Silence again. Real silence. The woman rushed to him, dropping to her knees, her child pressed against her as tears spilled freely. "No, no, stay with me." She pressed her hand against the wound, desperate to staunch the bleeding. His face was pale, but his eyes burned steady. "Don't waste tears," he muttered, his voice rough, still breathing. She sobbed harder, clutching his hand. Why would you do this for us?" For the first time since she had known him, something cracked in his gaze. Not suspicion, not stone, pain, and behind it, a grief deeper than the wound in his side. His voice came low, a whisper barely carried by the crackling fire. "Had a child. Long ago. Couldn't save her." His eyes flicked to her baby. Not again. Not this time. Her breath caught. The weight of his past, unspoken until now, fell between them. She understood then. He had not simply saved them out of pity or duty. He had saved them because he could not bear to watch history repeat itself. She pressed her forehead to his, tears mingling with the sweat on his brow. Then live. For her. For us. The night dragged long. She tended him with trembling hands, sewing his wound as best she could, feeding him broth when he stirred. He did not speak again, but his grip on her hand never loosened. When dawn broke, the snow lay red outside the cabin, but within its walls, life endured. The child slept, his small hand curled around the mountain man's rough finger. The woman sat beside them, exhaustion etched into her features, but her heart steadied. They had survived the storm, the hunger, the wolves, and now the men who hunted them. Yet survival was never the end. It was only the beginning of another day. When the man's eyes opened, weak but alive, she smiled through her tears. We'll carry on. Together. He gave the faintest nod. For the first time, the silence between them was not heavy but full of something unnamed, something fragile yet enduring. And outside, the mountains stood eternal, witnesses to a story of loss, defiance, and the fragile, unyielding bond that had been forged in the heart of winter.